Greetings to all. This program is done in the topic Role of Executive with special reference to bureaucracy, legislature, judiciary and non-government organization, and this is part 2 of the chapter. So today we are going to discuss about the legislature. First, we will take introduction and meaning of legislature, then role and importance of legislature. After that, the parliamentary and presidential realities, and then control exercised by legislature. After that, we will discuss the methods of control by legislature on executive and the various types and different methods of control, and after that the concluding part. So, we start with the introduction. The word legislature is a generic term meaning a body which legislates. It is the branch of government which formulates, amends or repeals the laws or policies for the society. Its authority to enact laws has its source in its representative character. All policies in a political system have to be set by legislative enactments except for such policy making that has been delegated to administrative branches and the courts. Legislature have another name for themselves, the rule making department. So, the legislature is a very important organ of the government which enacts the laws that makes the policies, and these policies are implemented by the executive. The most important role of the legislature is also controlling the executive, that how they are enacting the policies. In a democratic system, legislature is the fountain of all policies. The policy laid down by the legislature finds expression through the laws made or resolution passed by it. Usually, it places on the broad objectives which administration is to pursue, and in more important cases also the machinery and the procedure through which they are to be pursued. Under modern conditions, however, the scope of the state functions is so vast and many of them are so technical that the legislature largely confines itself to broad objects of a policy only, leaving the rest to administration. So, here I would like to add that the concept of welfare state has a great importance in these democratic countries, and the scope of the government functions has increased a lot. And at this time, when the legislature is full of burden, then they have to delegate its power to administrative officers, administrative bodies to make the laws. In recent time, the legislature has lost the initiative in policy making to the executive. The power of the legislature to formulate policies is real only in the constitutional sense, than in terms of practical politics. It is the cabinet or party in power which completely dominates the legislature in modern states. Therefore, power is not vested in the legislature as such, but in the party or groups which at particular time dominate its procedure and thereby succeed in taking policy decisions. The control which the legislature exercise over the executive is largely indirect. The vast majority of policies approved by the legislature are initiated by the cabinet with the aid and advice of the government departments. It is a fact that no longer how now politics administration dichotomy is in existence. the administration tries its best to carry out the policies as formulated by the legislature. The relationship between politics and administration has been strengthened further in the wake of delegated legislation. Legislators' lack of time, lack of interest, improper information regarding target area, and technical problems to be faced increase the responsibility of the administration in implementation of policies. But it does mean that the legislature has no role to play at all in implementation of policies. In cases where the policy initiated in the legislature is described in full details, it leaves little scope or choice with the administrative organs for implementing the same in any different mode. It rather sounds more logical in democratic systems that the policies should be discussed and formulated in detailed manner by the elected representatives of the people so that the same could be implemented in true spirit. Here I would like to add that the concept of delegated legislation has gaining importance in present times because the legislators have so much burden due to welfare state concept and their work area has been so vast. They have lack of interest also and improper information and technical know-how about the different policy areas. So they make the main policy and they leave other things, other detailing on the administrative officers, and these administrative bodies and officers, they fulfill the gap of the minute things. So this concept of delegated legislation has changed the functions and working of the legislations. Now this spirit says that the three sides of triangle of public policy formulation are legislature, political executive and permanent executive. Mostly at the initiative of the political executive, the policies are formulated in the legislature. The legislature has full control over political executive but no straight or direct control over permanent executive. The political executive is responsible to the legislature and the permanent executive is answerable and accountable to political executive. Thus, indirectly, the permanent executive has its relationship with the legislature so far as policy making and policy implementation is concerned. The elected representatives of the people feel much concerned about the implementation of the policies. The forum available to them to exercise check, control for bringing improvements in the implementation process is the legislature. If the legislature is the official agency for policy making, the executive is the official organ for executing these policies. But the old formula of policy making and policy execution concept has undergone an extensive reform in modern age. Today, the executive plays a much more important role in the modern political system because the political process is subject to dual pressures, public pressure from below and effective and powerful leadership from top. Vast extension of state activity has made the executive branch also a much more important organ. This has made it necessary to restate the classical doctrine of separation of powers. This doctrine of separation of powers was given by Montesquieu and it is implemented in the Constitution of United States of America, where this separation of power is there with the checks and balance system. The executive legislature and judiciary, all the three organs of the government have to work in coordination, but they should not interfere in the areas of each other. So, this is the doctrine of separation of power. But in today's contemporary context, this separation of power is not possible, especially in the parliamentary system, because the executive is formed from the legislature only. The majority party leader, who the party that wins in the lower chamber, and the leader of this party becomes the prime minister in parliamentary form of government. So, both are working hand in hand in parliamentary system. But in the presidential system in US, this doctrine of separation of power is running more practically. Today, the leadership in political system rests with either a prime minister or a president who controls his followers through the help of organized party system and distribution of patronage, etc. This has diminished or subordinated the role of the legislature to executive. The first and the former job of the executive, as its name suggests, is to run the administration of the country, maintenance of internal law and order, establishing peaceful foreign relations, providing basic needs to its citizens are its major tasks. In the modern age, however, it has assumed policy formulation job as well. Delegated legislation, it can be seen, has become an inescapable necessity. Now we come to the parliamentary and presidential realities. The role of legislature in policy implementation process is, however, indirect. In parliamentary type of government, political executive or the ministers are the members of parliament, and these ministers work on the principle of collective responsibility. In other words, they are collectively responsible to the parliament if there is any kind of mistake in the implementation of public policies. The government in such countries is organized into various ministries or departments. Being an integral part of the ministry, the political executive becomes automatically a part of the executive branch of the government. The relationship between the minister and the bureaucrats revolve around two basic fundamental principles. They are the principles of neutrality and anonymity. In the parliamentary system, the cabinet or the ministers, they work with the concept of collective responsibility, that one is responsible for all and all are responsible for the one, and they work as a team in the leadership of the prime minister, and they have to work together and they have to shoulder the responsibility of each other. In presidential form of government, the executive is not a member of the legislature, and therefore legislature's control over the implementation of public policy is not so extensive. However, due to the system of checks and balance, there may be some differences. For example, in USA, the president has the power to execute international agreements, but his actions has to receive the previous sanction of the Senate. In US system, the presidential system, the Senate is the upper chamber of the Congress, and this upper chamber of the Congress is very powerful in controlling the executive, that is the president. In totalitarian systems, political control is centralized in the hands of one or a few persons. They are the policy formulators as well as the implementers. Now, we will discuss the control exercised by the legislature, that how legislature controls the executive and by what methods it can control. All legislatures except into totalitarian countries exercise control and surveillance over the executive through a number of measures. Though the legislature delegates its task of policy formulation to the executive, the latter has to formulate and implement policies within the limits set by the former. In parliamentary system, legislature exercises control over the executive through parliamentary questions, adjournment motions, no confidence motions, etc. It passes the annual budget also. It can withdraw confidence against the ruling party and then compelling it to resign. Hence, the legislative control over administration is of three types. These are control over policy, control over implementation, and control over the finances. So, the legislative control is very important, and there are various methods adopted by the legislature to control the executive. The first method is the legislative questions. Every day, the first hour is devoted to the questioning of the executive functioning in any sphere within the jurisdiction of the government. The minister concerned is supposed to answer the questions raised by any member. In Indian Parliament, there exists the provision of the 0 hour in the legislature, and questions can also be raised, discussed and debated in the half an hour discussion at the end of the day for 3 days in a week when the parliament is in session. These legislative questions are very important because any member of the legislature can ask any minister about the implementation of policy or the progress of the any policy, that how it is implemented and what the targets are achieved or not. And this 0 hour discussion has given opportunity to various legislators to pose their questions. Now, the second one is the adjournment motion. It is a motion for adjournment of the business of the House for the purpose of discussing a definite matter of urgent public importance with the consent of the Speaker. The major objective of this device is to interrupt the normal business of the House and to seek the attention of the House and political executive towards the sensitive issue. Once permitted by the Speaker, the government has to answer the points raised, and that to the satisfaction of the members raising the motion. Now we come to the short duration discussion. A legislator keen to have short duration discussion on any urgent matter of public importance gives a notice in writing to the Secretary of the House, clearly indicating the issues and points he or she wants to have discussion on. His or her request must spell out the causes for his asking for short duration discussion. The next mode is the legislative committees. Besides standing committees, there are number of legislative committees like Committee on Government Assurance, Parliamentary Select Committee, Committee on Subordinate Legislation, Committee on Petitions, etc., where the government officials have to answer the points raised by the members. There is also provision for Parliamentary Committee of Investigation. This committee can ask for files and documents required in order to access what is being done and how. These legislative committees are very important committees to inquire into the important policy matters, and these committees inquire and they ask for files and documents also from various agencies to collect the data, and they give their report in front of the parliament. After looking to the report, they decide what action should be taken in the matter, in the policy matter, or policy implementation, or the policy execution. Now we come to the financial control. This is a very important portion of the control, because finances are the very important part of any country's working, and the whole country's this financial control is in the hands of legislature. This financial control is important in the legislative exercise to complete check on the administration through the budget under discussion. Only after ascertaining the targets assigned and achieved in the preceding year, the budget for the next year is sanctioned. Any matter can be raised during the budget debate. Issues of policy, economy, efficiency, efficacy, complaints, grievances, etc. can always be raised, and the minister concerned has to answer to the satisfaction of the House. Now the Comptroller and Auditor General, and this CAG or Comptroller, he audits the expenditure of the public money and is also used for controlling administration. This system ensures that the funds sanctioned by the legislature for a particular program are utilized in the proper spirit by the permanent executive. CAG report is placed in both the houses for discussion. This is quite an effective means of ensuring legislature's role and significance in policy implementation. I would like to add that the many reports of the Comptroller and Auditor General of India in various years, they have found out many scams in the government agencies or the semi-government agencies. Because of their reports, a better control is exercised over the administration and implementation of the plans. Now we come to the concluding part of this program. We have discussed about the introduction of the legislature and then meaning of the legislature. After that, we have discussed the important role of the legislature played in the public policy formulation and implementation. Then we discussed the importance of the legislature. After that, we have discussed thoroughly the parliamentary and presidential form of legislatures, and we have discussed the important characteristics of the parliamentary system of legislation and presidential form of legislation. Because in the parliamentary form of government, the executive and the legislature work hand in hand, but in presidential form of government, the executive and the legislature are working totally separately. So in this portion, we have discussed the realities of parliamentary and presidential form of legislatures. After that, we discussed the controls exercised by the legislature, and these controls exercised by the legislature are on the executive, because executive is the main implementer of these public policies, and they have to be asked about their implementation part. So the legislature plays a very important part in the control of executive, although in the present times the legislature is losing its powers over the executive, because the legislature has a majority party and the executive comes from this majority party only. Because of this party discipline, the executive is becoming more powerful these days than legislature. But even then, the legislature has its important role to play, and there are various methods of control exercised by the legislature, which we have discussed in this program. We have discussed various methods like the question hour or the supplementary questions, and then adjournment motion, and then the short duration discussions also, the 0 hour discussions, Then the legislative committees. These legislative committees play a very important role in controlling the executive, the formulation plan and the implementation plan both. These committees are of different types and they can call any person or they can get any document or other data for their work. So, these are very important controlling methods. After that, we have seen the financial control. As we know, the budget of a country is made by the legislature. So, the country's finances are in the hands of legislature and the legislature are the house of representatives of the people. So, the representative of the people, they control the financial part, and this financial control is very important, and the budget which is made by the legislature, the finance minister makes the budget and presents in the parliament, and the parliament discusses its all the provisions. The Comptroller and Auditor General of India controls the finances and general audits of expenditure of public money. They go to each and every department of the government and do the audit of their expenditure, and they ask questions about the expenditure, that how the government office has done this, and this system ensures that the funds sanctioned to the different departments are exercised or used properly or not. They have to be utilized in a proper manner. So, this Comptroller and Auditor General report is placed before both the houses and they discuss about the report, and as we know that many scams have come out of these Comptroller and Auditor General reports when it is placed in front of the parliament. So, the policy implementation is controlled by the legislature in this manner. As we know, the policies are formed by the legislature, but these policies are formed as only main portion or the broad outlines by the legislature. The detailed outlines and the details of this policy is made by the permanent executive, that is the bureaucracy, and it is left to the bureaucracy because the legislators, they are not aware of the proper data, and they, most of them have no knowledge about their ministry or the department. They are assisted by their permanent executive. So, this program has come to its conclusion, and the legislature plays an important role in policy implementing process by indirectly controlling the activities of the executive. The executive is answerable to legislature for its acts of policy implementation. To sum up, we can say in a democratic system of government, the executive has to be careful while implementing the policies. It does play a major role in policy formulation. The role of the legislature cannot be minimized in policy formulation and implementation. So, the legislature has a very important role to play in formulation of public policy and implementation of the public policy both, and its importance cannot be minimized by the executive, although the executive has become very important in the present times.